Hey, I'm Emma Grindle.
Hi, I'm Anna Sapal.
Hi, I'm Alicia Olvera.
Hi, I'm Abby Hoffman.
And this is our presentation on The Wife of Bath's Prologue and Tale by Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English literature.
Okay, here we have some biographical information on Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer was most likely born at his parents' house on Thames Street, which was adjacent to the west bank of Walbrook in London, England, in the year 1343. Geoffrey was born to two parents, John Chaucer and Agnes Compton. His family was of the bourgeois class. He was descendant from an affluent family who created their fortune from the London wine trade. According to numerous sources, Chaucer's father, John, even carried on the family wine business himself. Chaucer is believed to have attended the St. Paul's Cathedral School, where he learned about literature for the very first time. This is likely where he became acquainted with some of his first literary inspirations, such as Virgil and Ovid, who were Roman poets from the Augustan period. Apart from Geoffrey, John and Agnes possibly had a daughter named Catherine. Chaucer is considered the first finder of our language. He has also been referred to as the father of English literature, as the title of our presentation would imply, and is widely considered the greatest English poet of the Middle Ages. His most notable work, the Canterbury Tales, which will later be discussed in further detail, ranks as one of the greatest poetic works in English history. In addition to being an epic writer, he contributed in the later 14th century to the management of public affairs as courtier, diplomat, and civil servant.
History context. Chaucer was born in the 14th century, and that's also when the Canterbury Tales were written. In the 14th century, there were only three social classes with really no way of moving up in society, so you rarely ever saw any of the social classes really mingling with one another, rubbing elbows. But when Chaucer was born, he was born into an era of upper middle class. This is because his father was a prosperous merchant and mingled with all of society and not just one class. With his father having so many acquaintances, it must have exposed Chaucer to other people's views and perspectives. I believe in writing the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer also wanted to portray people from all walks of life and all social classes. Chaucer was also born into a time where poetry was read aloud. And although it began to transition in his era, you can still get the feel of entertainment from the characters themselves. Some have said that Geoffrey could have had inspiration from Boccaccio's Decameron. On one of his many trips to Italy, it's highly likely that Chaucer was exposed to Decameron's work and may have been inspired by it. The similarities are that although both wrote of different characters in their tales, Chaucer wrote of all societies and not just the upper class like Decameron did. Chaucer lived near the road to Canterbury, so he must have seen a number of different people, and those were the people that inspired him to write these tales.
Next, we have a list of Chaucer's major works. First, we have The Parliament of Fowls, 1380, Trolus and Crusade, mid 1380s, The Legend of Good Woman, 1386, The Canterbury Tales, 1387 to 1400. This is Chaucer's most famous and most recognized piece of work. And then we have A Treatise on the Astrolabe, 1391.
Then moving on to the first half of the prologue, The Wife of Bath. The Wife of Bath established that she believes in experience over authority. She then backs this experience mindset by describing her history of marriage as an authority figure in those relationships. She's had a total of 5 marriages, with the first taking place at just 12 years old. She's learned a lesson from each marriage. She defends what was at the time very untraditional views on sex and marriage. She makes a lot of biblical references, mostly negative. She doesn't feel her having been married 5 times is an issue, so she compares herself to the woman at the well, a parable in the Bible in which the woman also had 5 husbands. She cannot understand Jesus' rebuking this woman because she sees no issue with her lifestyle, probably because their lifestyles were very similar. She also goes on to speak about how God never commanded virginity, but instead cites the verse, "Go forth and multiply," in an attempt to defend her choices. We see here that she lives a lustful life, which just means that she enjoys sex and is not afraid to show it, as we can see from the prologue. We can also tell this from her gap tooth, which is an indicator of promiscuity. At her introduction of the first 2 husbands, we learn they were significantly older than the wife, which at least today would raise questions of maybe the men taking advantage of her, but in reality she is bullying them and serves as the boss in the relationship, as we've already established. She used sex as a means of control in these relationships. She would give her husband sex, and in exchange they would give her their riches and their heart. The husbands would die after the wife gained ultimate sovereignty over them. She believed they would die happy because their relationship was about compromise. But in her eyes, the compromise meant that she would give them sex and they would essentially give her everything that they owned. Some additional views on my perspective. The wife of Baths served as a new sort of narrative. She had the power over her husbands, which was extremely uncommon during this time. She also lived a lustful life and was married several times, both of which were looked down on this time period. One could argue this story showcased a feminist character far ahead of her time.
Husbands. So reiterating that her first 3 husbands were very much in love with her. They were all really similar to one another. They were rich, they were old, and they were easily manipulated by her. All 3 easily gave up their riches and the deeds to their land to prove their love for her. She was young and sexual, but she does say that the manipulation didn't come free, as she often had to give herself up in bed in order to keep her husbands believing that she did want to be with them. Now, her 4th husband is different than her previous 3 husbands. He was a little younger and he was a partier. He provided her with wine and loved getting her drunk because it was easy to get her in the sack. She believed that he was a womanizer and he was unfaithful. He also has a wandering eye, and that just added fuel to the fire. He was more resistant to her tactics and wasn't as easily manipulated like her previous 3 husbands were. In believing that her 4th husband was cheating, she too began to wander with her eyes and quickly found someone that she had her eye on. So when her 4th husband dies, she plays the part of a grieving wife and pretends that she's mourning, but in reality, she's just ready to move on to that 5th husband she has lined up already. Now, her 5th husband, the one who's already lined up after the death of her 4th husband, is much different than all of her previous husbands. He's younger than she is, and she's truly in love with him. He isn't rich, and he doesn't have any land, so there's no monetary value to that relationship, but she is in love with him and his looks, so much so that she gives him her riches and deeds that she had previously acquired in other marriages in order to show her love for him. Now, this is where the sense of karma comes into play, and the prologue begins to climax. She's in her little bubble of love, but almost as soon as she gives him all of her valuables and control over her, he begins to withhold affection from her, and he even blames her and women altogether for the downfall of men. He nightly reads from this book and tells her different stories of why women are terrible. and she can't stand it, and she stands up for herself as much as she can, but ultimately she ends up tearing this book up, and he beats her with it, hitting her so hard on the side of the head with the book that it causes permanent damage to her hearing. This uh, this is where she says that regardless of the beating, she still loves him, and he can still hypnotize her with his sexual charm. He starts to feel bad about all of the beatings, and he ultimately just gives up and lets her do as she pleases. This is where the wife of Bath sets the stage for her tale, foreshadowing that you can't have your cake and eat it too. She either has husbands that were old but rich, or a younger husband who was actually in love with her but had no monetary value in him, and he would treat her poorly. She spends a lot of her time in the prologue defending this type of manipulative behavior and almost justifying it, and she's completely unapologetic of this behavior.
The story of the wife of Bath's tale. The tale begins to start by the wife of Bath telling us about Britain in the days of old. She then tells us about a knight of King Arthur's court. One day, while riding along the river, this knight rapes a young maiden. When the king found out, he was outraged and demanded that the knight should be beheaded immediately. The queen then begged and asked the king if she could decide the knight's punishment, and then he agreed and said yes. The queen then asked the knight the question, "What do women desire the most?" The knight has 1 year to answer this question, or then he will die. The knight began to ask many people the question, and they all answered differently. He then comes along a group of beautiful women who he wants to ask, but when he approaches them, they all go away. The knight then saw an ugly old lady sitting on the grass. He then told her and explained his situation, and she agreed to help him as long as he promised to do everything that she asks, and he did.
Okay, so the wife of Bath's tale continued. Um, the knight and the old lady go to the queen, and when they get there, he tells the queen and the other women with her that women just want to have power over their husbands. The queen affirms that and says it was true and that was the right answer. And then the old lady asks the knight to marry her, and reluctantly he does. So later on, when the queen kind of realizes something's off with the knight, she asks what's wrong with him. And then he says he cannot bear the shame of having an ugly wife. Then the old lady makes a statement that kind of makes the knight think about what he just said. She says, "True riches lie in having nothing and wanting little." And so she then gives the knight of choice is if he would rather her be ugly and truthful or beautiful and treacherous. And the knight ponders this, and he kind of has to think about it, and he decides that he would trust her judgment, and that would be pleasing to his wife because it is what she is deciding. She then transforms into a beautiful woman, and they have a happy marriage, and it's kind of like a happily ever after moment. Chaucer's impact on English literature. So his main source of income didn't come from writing, it came from the civil service jobs and like the royal annuities. But he made the biggest impact in his life within the world of literature and writing and his works. And with that, he made 3 huge contributions to English literature. Um, he became the father of modern day English literature, and that just kind of like shaped from then on out, shaped how writing was and was portrayed. He chose to write his poetry in English rather than French or Latin, And this writing in the Middle English, the vernacular was spoken in the 14th century, and this indicated like a major shift in British literature. So it's kind of like a complete turnaround change. And then he introduced two poetic conventions, the iambic pentameter and the rhyme royal, to English poetry, which is huge because many like poems and stories and writings include these two things, and he created them. So I thought that was pretty cool. Chaucer's poetry influenced and inspired many of Great Britain's authors, poets, and even play writers followed him, and that was including William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare became a huge fan of Chaucer. He kind of took his techniques of the iambic pentameter and the rhyme royal, and he learned the use of language and narrative framing techniques, and that created distinctive voices within the strong characters in his story. So Chaucer definitely had a huge impact on English and British literature, and even in writings today.